I want to approach this data from the question of why. So first of all, why me? Why take on this project? And an answer for that begins with the awareness that it nearly killed me. Meaning these series of events, deeply traumatizing, moving into PTSD, many ripple effects. Long and short, I nearly died. Now, we all know that these are not personal. We pay any attention to high, quit taking it personally. So if we don't take it personally, then we have to say that at least from time to time, high facilitators and board members and team members collaborate to engage with participants in ways that lead to trauma and the participant nearly dying. And apparently it's not a high issue. It's not something High is willing and able to address at this time. So there you go. Now, I looked at this and said, okay, I've nearly died a few times. I've nearly gone crazy. I've developed PTSD. I've lost, I don't know, let's just say a minimum of $200,000 in lost revenue, and probably a lot more. And I've spent, years of my life deeply disabled. I think, okay, that's not personal either. So look at the abuse data and yeah, that's having your first homosexual experience with an older therapist, that'll do it. Having it covered up, that'll do it. And being left to bear the full consequences of that without being paid a penny, yeah, that'll do it. Okay, so we know it's not personal. We know why it's happening. We don't know exactly how much because High has a protocol of secrecy and shaming the victim. So is it 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100, 1 in 10,000? We don't know exactly, but it happens from time to time. It's not personal. It is life endangering, and it happened to me. Well, people have told me I'm one of the most articulate human beings they've ever met. And I could barely speak in this terrain. So what's the conclusion? That someone who is highly inarticulate would be able to put this into words, something that nobody actually wants to deal with, but could still say it clearly enough that it got dealt with? No. In other words, if I can barely speak about these things, if they're so painful, and people pay me the compliment of being articulate, then heaven help the person who isn't articulate. So what does that mean? Meaning if I can barely talk and I've got that strength and it needs to be talked about, well, shouldn't the person who has the best ability in that area take it on? Does the community thrive if the High facilitator base behind closed doors are imploding their mission and nobody knows about it because they're silencing people? Well, it's practical to ask the person who's halfway decent at speaking to take it on. Because if not, then who? Who's going to do it? I also have more spare time than 90% of working America. And this takes a ton of time, 1,000 hours of psychological research, learning to put it into words, building websites to overcome the high information blockade. So it's going to take a lot of time. Well, I've got more time than 90% of you. So if it's too much for me to take on, it's 10 times too much for anyone else to take on. So that's why. Meaning, if I can't do it, which there's not any guarantee, if I can't shift high, or in the absence of instilling best practices, see that it gets shut down, who else is going to do it? So that's the why of me. That's just an ethical and practical equation. But why do I care about the fact that rather than my request to Ann Watts that we tell the community, why do I care about the fact that she persuaded me that it was in my interest, as well as Peter Sandhill's interest, not to talk about it? Well, it has major repercussions. So at that time, I had shattered an identity, meaning I had trusted Peter Sandhill to take a much higher dose of 2 psychedelic compounds than I was comfortable with, because he promised to take care of me and that this was in my interest as well. So he was busy promising what was good for my interest long before Anne got started. And that led to a romantic relationship. The long and short of it was that the weird, insane journey induced by Peter Sandhill's brand of leadership was so crazy-making, so traumatizing, so heartbreaking, so absurd, that first of all, I don't think anyone can understand what it was like. Now, if you get hit by a car tomorrow and you break your ribs and you fracture your skull and you're in hospital for 6 months and you're in excruciating pain, we are a materialistic culture, and so people are going to get that. And they're not going to ask you to pay rent if they're halfway decent. Of course, we're not halfway decent, so your landlord will have evicted you in that period. But if you're halfway decent, we have some sense of humanity around that. But we have no sense of decency and humanity around deeper, more traumatic psychological wounds and romantic wounds in a psychologically illiterate culture in which people just don't get it. They don't get that psychedelic compounds can amplify the pain by 100 times. They don't get that having 4 of your therapists push you into a position that harms you is psychologically devastating. They don't get it because we are committed to psychological illiteracy in our cult. We're committed to it at high, and we're committed to it even more in the broader public. And they're not going to get it without support and help. Now, how can you love and empathize with a person if you cannot understand them at all? Like, I have some sense of what it's like to be African American in America, and it's horrifying because we are still a cult that shames the victim. There is still a tremendous amount of chauvinistic thrust that basically says, you know, if you didn't stick up for yourself, if you went along with this, that it's really on you. You know, it's what kind of person puts up with that. And this is the way that we shame the victim. It's devastating to know that your ancestors were raped, beaten, burned alive, whipped, humiliated, and treated like animals. That kind of trauma and rage, that type of cruelty You see, America has not dealt with its shadow. America does not want to deal with the fact that there's a deep sociopathic element that is default in every American psyche, that is cruel, that is filled with fear and hate, that denigrates femininity, and with it, perception of weakness and vulnerability. We don't want to deal with the fact we just nearly had a Capitol riot. We are not better than the Hitler Youth. We just have different protocols. We have not been incited with, Trump was not as effective as Hitler, frankly, at radicalizing the shame, the fear, the trauma that is deeply intergenerational in this cult. I'm sure if he could have gotten away with it, he would have. But there is no big gap between Germans and Americans, or Russians and Americans. We just lucked out to a certain extent in having at least some ideals, a constitution, and luckily a majority have decided to uphold that constitution despite the fact that it threatens their power. And Trump in the end got on a plane and took off. But don't think for a moment that if he had been further enabled, he wouldn't have become a dictator and would not have descended the country into a Nazi Germany type situation. If he had a little bit more intelligence, a little bit more strategy to release the cruelty of the abused child. Because both Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler were severely shamed and abused children in a way that left them in contempt of their own inner child, who couldn't win in the battle with the giants, who felt so much self-loathing that they were constantly shamed and made to feel inadequate. And that bubbles up in the psyche. You see, and no one protected Hitler in Germany, and no one protected Trump in America. When you direct that level of cruelty to a child, they eventually give it back to the cult that gave it to them. And that's as it should be, because how can the cult learn to parent its children? I mean, one of these days we'll get sick of the trillions of dollars it costs us to have traumatized children for leaders operating from their reptilian brain. One of these days we'll say, you know what? We just spent another $2 trillion on another ridiculous war. Why don't we spend $2 trillion providing emotional literacy to our children instead? Why don't we start a parenting course to actually tell parents up front the statistical odds based on data that they will be sociopathic and traumatize their children? Do parents have a right to know that? You know, your father was an alcoholic. Your mother was a sociopath. They both had PTSD. You're carrying symptoms of shame. You've got a rage addiction. You're obsessive and perfectionistic, trying to get love that should have been given to you otherwise. The profile, through no fault of your own, if you have a child, is 87% that your child will be heavily shame-based and traumatized by the time they're 14 years old. That's what the data shows us. And we may be too dumb to heal you as a human being in our current obsession with money, but we will at least give you this data and you can decide, and we'll also let your child know this data as they grow up so they understand it's not personal. We at least gave your parents this information about the likelihood of these traits being intergenerational because we gave a damn about you and we studied the data. It wouldn't cost even $1 billion to send that email out to every person prior to having a child. Put a few $100 million of national ads and go to this website and learn about competency in parenting and the odds that you will abuse your children and what you can do about it. And if you're an abused child, look at the different ways that you could be being abused. Rank your parent and understand what your odds are, that it's not your fault, and that we apologize to you as a country, that we are putting more money into our military than we are housing our homeless or protecting our abused children. We could do that. Or we could just blame Hitler and blame Trump. And talk about what horrible people they are. We're not horrible for enabling it. We're not horrible for doing nothing to raise the next generation of psychologically illiterate children. No. It's them. It's them. So, these are our issues. And one of the reasons that I'm keen to do this with Hai and with Peter and, with communities like Findhorn, meaning the first male that sexually abused me was at the Findhorn community at Scotland when I was 13 years old. Did Findhorn send out a survey? How many people have been sexually abused by older men at Findhorn? No. They're too spiritual, right? And these things just get swept under the carpet and they build up until they explode. So, part of the shadow shame game and part of the scapegoating game is you just pick someone, Hitler, Trump, someone who's bad, and we can all agree is bad, and we're not being judgmental, they're just bad. Could we just find some evil person, Kim Jong-un, Putin? Let's just find someone we can all dump our shame and hostility on. Let's not look into Putin's childhood. Let's not look at the massacre of his innocence. Let's not look at the way that massacre is institutionalized. Let's not look at our CIA either. Let's not look at the many sociopathic programs of the loyal Americans, and let's not take care of our vets. Let's just find some horrible person to blame for all of our stupidity, all of our cruelty. So one of the reasons why that I'm interested in this is I grew up learning how lucky I was and how privileged I was and how superior I was and how superior my family was and how superior my father was and my mother was, and that if only people could take Hai like I was, the world would be a better place. And so there's a lot of elevation going on. We would never do what Donald Trump did and this and that. But I think that's false. Meaning even the elevation of, the horrible Peter, but the poor Dane, I think that's false. I mean, admittedly, if we get to the point where we lay it on the dissociated, traumatized therapeutic patient who has been paying money to be protected finally, being predated by their psychopathic therapist, and they should have known better. I mean, we're going into crazy land. But I have to own that my little boy learned how to enable a sociopathic, narcissistic father by not making him upset and going along with it as much as it could, because that was the only way to get any love and attention. So I knew just how Peter needed to be treated and understood the rules. You don't get any love and attention unless you go along with my insanity. And my little boy is desperate for love and attention and went along with the insanity to a point that is completely understandable when you understand that Peter Sandhill promised my little boy to love him in a way that no man has ever even promised, let alone, got anywhere near to do it, got anywhere. I mean, Peter Sandhill gave me this promise to be there. And no one else had, not even close, I reached out to 40 men at the Human Awareness Institute. And one day I got tired of doing all the outreach. They all kept saying, "Oh, I was just thinking about you. I was going to call you back." And I said, I've heard that from 40 men. They were all just thinking about me. So glad I called. They were just about to call me. And I said, I'm tired of all 40 pretending that it's such a burden to be friends with another male. Let's see what happens if I never call any of you again. Will one of you ever pick up that proverbial phone that you were just about to? Not one. 40 for 40, and here's Peter promising to take a stand for his life and sure, you had to pay him. That's what it comes down to in our cult around male friendship. If you pay them to be your friend, maybe they'll at least do what they say. But here was Peter promising, it's like, I want that. How crazy do I have to go to get it, is the question. Pretty crazy. And if it was just a bit crazy, I was fine with it. It wasn't until it nearly killed me that I thought, this is too expensive even for one decent male, quote unquote, relationship. And I understand why in a cult that produces so few quality, healthy relationships, that when it's good some of the time, you put up with a lot of shit rather than having nothing. So I understand that. And I understand a little bit more in this thing because I lied to myself about how crazy it was because I wanted the words. They're better than nothing. If you have nothing and I'm worthless and I'm contemptuous, and you go to, I'm treated like nothing, but I have words of how valuable I am, well, it seems like progress. It's in fact stepping towards insanity. So it's a really big deal to go through this amount of pain and crisis, period. You're not supposed to, the data suggests, go through trauma alone. And you are never more alone than when your one companion is your perpetrator, who has another agenda to keep it all under wraps. You are alone. You're more than alone. Because under the guise of friendship, you're being pushed under the carpet. I could have dealt with this relatively easily and not developed PTSD if a single high facilitator had sent out an email to the community and said, hey guys, we fucked up. Sorry, it happens sometimes. But you, the participants, are our number one priority. And what we want you to do now is give some support to the people we fucked up and hurt. And we're going to get our act together and we're going to bring in some expert help because we don't want this to happen again. But Dane Rose needs support right now. He needs to be listened to. He needs to be held. That's what he's asked for. We're committed to giving him what he needs. Please do that. Ann Watts, Peter Sandell, Peter Rangel, any of them. A board member could have asked for that. I would have, with 3 supportive people, avoided permanent, perhaps, PTSD. But instead, it went ice cold. I became the biggest fear of the Human Awareness Institute to be managed. And I understood the new contract of insanity, which was don't tell anyone. We're the Human Awareness Institute. We just don't want anyone to know what's going on. I didn't need to be more crazy at the time. So that one little piece, which is currently high's default, no one's ever going to know if you get fucked over by a high facilitator because they will do everything they can to convince you it didn't happen. That's the first round. Then, if they have to admit that it happened, then they will convince you that it's best that no one knows about it. And if you don't agree with that, then they will stonewall you entirely and tell you all the reasons it's your fault, basically. That causes PTSD. And as I say, I'm fighting that position for the next victim. It's not going to do me any good at this point, but it can save someone's life. It's important. You can go through almost anything if you're not alone, if you're understood, and you have at least one person who's prioritizing your well-being above your abuser. The high facilitators have basically demonstrated they cannot do that. That's fine. Many abusers and power figures cannot deal with that kind of conflict of interest. They just can't. That's why the responsibility has to be to get you help from people who can. Because the irony is that the 1 or 2 people in the community that I reached were more effective than the facilitators. And the reason is simple. They didn't have an agenda of silence, secrecy, diminishment, and shame. When I'm going through more pain than I've gone through in my entire life, and the facilitators are trying to downplay it, I go into a panic. Because the more they downplay it, the more I need to point out, no, you must not have gotten it. So then I'm reliving it and reliving it. But their agenda is to keep it minimized because that makes them feel good. So the why is it's also for choice. Now, if you're familiar with abuse contracts with parents and authority figures, and you know how to play them, some in the high community and on team, they're very comfortable signing abuse contracts with, they basically they sign up for relationships that any psychologist would say are highly abusive. And they want to please their abuser and get some kudos, which they learned in childhood. That's the only way to win in a narcissistic and abuse family. It's not their fault. It's just the question, when is the Human Awareness Institute going to bring in the data and the books and stuff that people could start acknowledging and realizing what's going on and why? So, it's vital that people know what's going on so that they can offer support. You have to currently watch about 30 hours of video to have enough psychological competency to understand my feelings induced by Peter Sandhill in the facilitator body. As an American, as a narcissist, as a chauvinist, you've got better things to do with your time. You've got TV shows to watch, Facebook to scroll, texting to do, drinking, sexting. You've got things to do. The average American is spending 6 hours a day on their phone, not watching these videos. So the cult has basically insulated its victims from being known, from being seen. And you cannot attune to, understand, and love what you refuse to know. Now, all you have to do is overlay the chauvinism, all the judgments. Why is this man being so emotional? What's the big deal? What did one of the interns say? A niggy sob or something. There's a nice set of whole labels that chauvinists create to basically shame the victim for having intense feelings. And as a result of that shame and the scapegoating of the victim, it alleviates the responsibility for an ignorant majority to become literate. Because it's 6 hours a day of Netflix and phone flipping and all of that, you could become literate in a week, 2 at the most. And you'd actually understand how to care for your sister when she's sexually molested or abused, or your brother who had a weird encounter with a stranger and feels completely fucked up about it and doesn't know how to talk about his feelings about it because he's in a cult where as soon as he's emotional, he's going to be shamed by the internal abuser that took on the shame of being raged at for having feelings as a young boy. You could take the time, but you're not going to as a statistic, which means that I will not be known as a statistic, which means that I cannot be loved, which means that as a result of trusting the Human Awareness Institute to be my teacher in love, intimacy, and healthy sexuality, I have been repeatedly sexually abused by a high facilitator, paid for the abuse both times, shamed and cast out of the community for talking about it. And you will not understand how that feels. And you will not understand how the next victim feels. Because you are too pathologically dumb to understand your ignorance. And would rather get dopamine on a phone. That's why I'm talking about this. Because the next victim, as well as myself, deserves much better. And so the trick in a relatively sociopathic dynamic where we all feel like we're going to die as we confront certain traumatic abuse cycles in our family where we were almost killed for challenging them. You know, there's a part of me that feels like I'm going to die every time I talk about these things, because I would have been killed for revealing these things in my family. And Peter basically followed the family playbook and then high-piled on. And then everyone stood by, unwilling to challenge the authority figure, unwilling to confront the abuser. It's horrifying, because that's not personal. It's what you go through. It's what you go through. It's what you go through. It is essential for the species, for the community, for High's future, if there is one, that this be dealt with competently. It's essential for my future that I grasp my participation in the abuse contracts and break free of those contracts so that I can create a different model of relationship going forward. It's essential for Peter Sandhill to see the cruelty, the blindness, the hate, the loyalty to his own abusers, if he's not going to do this to his son and everyone around him to one degree or another. It's not personal. None of these things are. The ways that you may feel abused by me are not personal either. And as a sensitive and as an empath, one part of me doesn't want to do any of this because it's uncomfortable to know that it's going to make someone feel bad to hear these things. And that's one reason to kill myself in the saga that began with writing about my plan to commit suicide. If my existence causes this much trouble to all these wonderful people, maybe I should just die to make it easier for them. After all, it's all my fault. I didn't do it right. I should have, paid more money, fought with my therapist more violently. What would I have had to do? I'm talking about this because it's significant. Significant on every matrix, on every dimension that matters for the health of our cult. The masculine-feminine honor balance, emotional literacy, abuse of power, sustainability as a community, sustainability as a species. Do we operate from the reptilian brain or the empathic brain? It's very, very simple. Whoever's in the most pain, I don't know about the facilitators, but I've gotten used to being in 4 times more pain than I was before this occurred. And by used to, what I mean is at first I thought it was going to kill me. And then I realized it's just going to debilitate me indefinitely. And, I can get in touch with a part of me that's not in pain. And that part moves through the part of me that is in enormous grief, enormous numbness, enormous and horrific levels of sadness, grief, trauma, and pain. And I've learned to move through that, basically. And I've learned that while it may lead to a variety of complicating factors, that level of pain is not directly going to kill me. And so it's become normal, the new normal. And I can work with it. It's like lifting a 200-pound weight the first time and nearly being crippled, and then carrying it around for 4 years, and after a while you develop the compensating and the muscles and stuff to be able to lift that amount of pain. The question is, why have I been handed that pain to carry for you? If you belong in this community, if you have these values, Why are you isolating the victim rather than welcoming them into your heart? Because that's not personal either. That means your victim has not been loved by you, has been betrayed and stepped on, has been banished for telling the truth. It's not personal, it's fractal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal because the exact same way that I've been cast out of the community for telling these truths, your pain has been cast out by you and the community and is unable to tell its truth. And that part has things to teach you. So with each of these things, there's a really personal, and the personal is the collective in fractal technology. You think you're talking all about yourself, you're talking about the species. It's a big deal to all of us, and I care about it. It's the biggest source of my pain, and as I do the mathematics, it's the biggest pivot point for the community, the species, for you, and that's why.